My father manipulated me for years, but I finally broke the cycle and rebuilt my life. I don't know exactly when my life began to unravel amid obligations that were never mine, but looking back, I realized it was a slow, silent process, almost invisible to outsiders. The routine seemed ordinary: work, study, help around the house. But little by little, responsibility stopped being a choice and became an imposition. I became the foundation of my family, even though I didn't have the emotional or financial means to carry that burden. At first, I thought it was normal, that it was part of my role. After all, I'd always been taught that family comes first. But something was wrong, a nagging feeling that I was living for others and not for myself. That uneasiness grew within me, even though I tried to silence it. The center of all this pressure was my father. Edgar had an authoritarian, self-righteous manner, the kind that doesn't ask but commands. For many years, he used my achievements, my efforts, and even my salary as an extension of his own life. I had no choice: either give in or face a war within the home. My stepmother, Patricia, compounded this scenario with looks of contempt and words that always labeled me as extra weight. It was as if I were tolerated but never truly accepted. And as much as it hurt, I stayed. I stayed because I was afraid, because I believed my duty was to maintain that sandcastle, even when everything inside me screamed that I was losing it. At that time, I hadn't yet presented myself to the world as I truly was. I lived disguised as an obedient daughter, a responsible person, someone who could handle anything. Only later did I understand how much of an emotional prison that was. But before I get to that, I need to give some context. My name is Marina, and this story happened when I was in my early 30s. I was already working, I had already made my mark outside the home, but I still carried the guilt of believing I was only someone who served my family. Life seemed to follow a predefined script, leaving no room for my own dreams. Everything revolved around being available to Edgar's demands, and any attempt to set boundaries was seen as rebellion or ingratitude. The first signs that I was burning out appeared discreetly: constant fatigue, unexplained physical pain, sleepless nights with racing thoughts. I pretended everything was fine, smiled at work, told friends it was just a phase, but deep down, I felt like I was trapped in an invisible cage. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run away, but I lacked the courage. And my father's voice always echoed in my mind, repeating that without him I would be nothing, that I owed him my life, that I couldn't abandon him. It was a kind of emotional blackmail that kept me trapped, even when I already knew it wasn't right. It was in this context that an unexpected figure began to make a difference: my Aunt Inez. She was never afraid to contradict my father, and, in a way, was the only person in the family who saw me as a whole, not just a support system for others. Her words echoed in the most difficult moments. "Marina, you don't have to carry the world on your shoulders to prove you're a good daughter. You deserve to live too." I listened, but it was as if my heart wasn't yet ready to believe it. Deep down, I longed for this freedom, but I didn't know if I would be able to achieve it. It was like standing before an open door, but with my feet bound by invisible chains. Despite my Aunt Inez's words, I remained paralyzed. It was as if two versions of me coexisted in the same body, one that dreamed of freedom, and another that trembled at the thought of breaking ties. The fear of disappointing, of being called selfish, of becoming the ungrateful daughter, consumed me. And the worst part was that, at times, I myself believed my father's lies. He always said that I was his only certainty, that without me he would have nowhere to go, that I was the only one who truly cared. Words that seemed like a compliment but were actually invisible shackles, keeping me trapped. This emotional turmoil wore me down more than any workday or practical obligation. It was a mental prison, made of guilt, duty, and manipulation. Things escalated when Patricia, my stepmother, decided to jump ship. She'd never liked me, and I can't say it surprised me, but the way she discarded my father was brutal. One day, she simply packed her bags and left home, leaving him alone and furious. But instead of dealing with the consequences of his choices, he turned to me. He started calling every day, asking for financial help, demanding my presence. I'd tried to set boundaries before, but now it seemed impossible. He used Patricia's abandonment as justification to hold me even tighter. If she couldn't stay with me, you can't abandon me either. The phrase was repeated like a mantra, eroding any shred of independence I'd tried to cultivate. During that time, I hit rock bottom emotionally. My anxiety attacks became more intense, and there were days when I could barely get out of bed. I cried alone, in silence, so as not to worry my grandparents, Aparecida and Amaro, who were my refuge in my darkest moments. They represented the opposite of what I experienced with my father: love without demands, acceptance without blackmail. I often took refuge in their house, just to breathe some fresh air, hear old stories, and feel that there was still some space in the world where I was simply Marina, without titles or roles. But even there, my father's shadow haunted me. He called, demanded, said I was abandoning my own family. I almost gave up. There was a night when I seriously considered leaving everything behind: my job, my ties, the city, leaving without looking back, disappearing. I grabbed a suitcase and started packing some clothes. My heart was pounding, my hands were shaking, and for the first time, I felt like escape might be the only way out. But as I folded a blouse, I heard my grandmother's voice in the kitchen, softly singing an old song. That made me stop. I thought about how hard it would be for them to lose me too, after everything they'd been through. It was at that moment that I realized I didn't need to disappear to free myself. What I needed was the courage to face, from the inside out, the root of this entire prison: my father. The decision didn't come suddenly, but from that moment on, something changed inside me. I understood that the true escape wasn't physical, but emotional. There was no point in running if the chains remained within me. I needed to cut the bonds of manipulation, even if it meant facing accusations, fights, and blackmail. And believe me, it wasn't easy. I spent days rehearsing phrases I'd never had the courage to say. I can't help you. That's not my responsibility. I need to think about myself now. Each word felt like a battle, each attempt an internal earthquake. But I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. Either I learned to say no, or I would continue destroying myself in the name of someone who never saw me as a daughter, only as support. The first confrontation happened one Sunday, during lunch at my grandparents' house. My father arrived unexpectedly, with that heavy look I knew so well. He sat at the table and began complaining about life, abandonment, debt, loneliness. I had heard that speech countless times, but this time something inside me was different. I no longer felt pity. I felt a deep weariness, as if each of his words were a stone being placed on my back. When he asked for money in front of everyone, I took a deep breath and said, "I can't help you, Dad." It was the first time I had uttered those words firmly. The silence that fell at the table felt like a contained storm. He looked at me in disbelief, then anger, but I didn't back down. That sentence, simple and short, was my first real act of freedom. His reaction was predictable: accusations, yelling, the same old narrative that I was ungrateful and selfish. But unlike other times, I didn't cry or try to justify myself. I just got up and left the table. My entire body was shaking, but there was something new inside me, a sense of relief. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time, I felt like I had a choice, that I wasn't forced to carry this forever. It wasn't a moment of glory, it was a moment of rupture. Painful, yes, but absolutely necessary. After that day, my father began an even more intense campaign to bring me back to the role of responsible daughter. He called several times a day, left dramatic messages, and tried to guilt-trip me. Sometimes it almost worked. I would pick up the phone to return the calls, rehearse excuses, and consider giving in. But then I would remember how it felt to say no at that lunch. That was my anchor. I repeated to myself, "You have a right to your life. You don't have to destroy yourself to take care of him." This phrase became my daily mantra, a kind of shield against emotional manipulation. It was during this turbulent period that unexpected support emerged. Claudio, a distant cousin I barely knew. He found me on social media, asked how I was, and gradually became a shoulder to lean on. Claudio wasn't afraid to speak the truth, but he did so with respect. He would say, "You don't owe your father anything. Being a daughter doesn't mean being an emotional slave." These conversations helped me reinforce what I already knew, but hadn't yet had the courage to fully admit. I realized that sometimes support comes from where we least expect it, and that can be the spark needed for change. As the months passed, I began to build a new routine. I established clear boundaries: no answering calls after hours, no sending money, no giving in to blackmail. At first, I felt guilty, but also a growing peace. It was like learning to walk again after years of crawling. I began investing more in myself, courses, activities I enjoyed, small moments of leisure that previously seemed an impossible luxury. I discovered hobbies that made me feel alive again. Even my health began to improve. Fewer anxiety attacks, more restful nights of sleep. It was a slow but tangible transformation. I was no longer the same Marina who lived in fear, even though my father still tried to pull me back to that place. The real test came a few months later, when my father unexpectedly reappeared. He had been rejected by his own family, and with that, came back into my life asking for reconciliation. I confess I felt a pang of compassion. For a moment, that old impulse to care for him, to be the daughter he wanted, returned. But I took a deep breath and asked myself, how far will you let him decide your happiness? The answer came immediately, clear and firm. I realized that loving myself wasn't selfish, it was survival. And in that moment, I made the decision. That would change everything. I would no longer sacrifice myself for his emotional comfort. I needed to protect my peace. Deciding not to give in was painful. He begged, cried, blamed me in every way. There were days when I thought I'd made a mistake, that maybe I was being cruel. But then I remembered the years of manipulation, the times I'd given up living my own dreams to support a castle that wasn't mine. And that was precisely what gave me strength, the knowledge that my life was now my own. I realized it wasn't just about money or obligations, but about respect. Respect for my history, my limits, my choices. During this time, my grandmother Aparecida and grandfather Amaro were crucial. They constantly reminded me that I wasn't wrong, that my courage was necessary and just. Their words and gestures of affection served as fuel for my weary heart. It was comforting to know that true love didn't require destructive sacrifices, and that I could find emotional security outside of my father's hands. Every visit, every conversation, reinforced the idea that there was life beyond guilt and manipulation. I began to believe in myself in a concrete way, not just as a distant hope, but as a possible reality. At the same time, I began rebuilding my social and professional circle. Old friends, whom I had neglected for years due to family obligations, became part of my life again. Work began to become not just a source of income, but a space for personal fulfillment. Every achievement, no matter how small, strengthened my sense of independence. I began to feel that I no longer needed to depend on anyone's approval to feel worthy or valuable. Each step I took was a brick in the path of rebuilding my self-esteem, a step away from my father's shadow. The most significant point of this journey was realizing that my freedom didn't depend on the rejection of others, but on my own acceptance. I could love my father, respect him as a father, but without nullifying myself, without losing myself. This understanding was liberating. For the first time in many years, I felt I could choose. To choose to live my life my way, to set boundaries, to protect my peace, and still be human and loving, without giving in to manipulation. It was at that moment that I realized, love doesn't mean destroying yourself to support another, and that, finally, I was whole, even with the pain I still carried. Over the next few months, my life began to take shape in a much more balanced way. I began to prioritize my projects, my dreams, and my well-being. The feeling of being in control of myself was unprecedented and, at the same time, frightening. But every decision I made, no matter how small, solidified my independence. I learned to acknowledge my emotions without letting them dominate me, to say no without feeling guilty, and to celebrate small victories as real achievements. It was a gradual process, with stumbles, tears, and doubts. But each step reinforced the certainty that I was on the right path. Contact with my cousin Claudio became an unexpected source of support. He accompanied me on important decisions, listened to me without judgment, and offered sincere advice. Sometimes I was surprised how someone so distant, without obligation, could have such a positive impact on my life. This support reinforced the realization that family is not just a blood bond, but also a set of relationships that strengthen us. And I began to build new bonds, the kind that don't require destructive sacrifices, but rather respect and reciprocity. Over time, I realized that the pain of the past still existed, but it no longer defined me. The memory of manipulation, demands, and family pressure became just one chapter in my life, not the whole book. I learned that emotional freedom doesn't mean completely cutting ties, but choosing which relationships are worth nurturing and which need to be left behind. Every no I said to my father, without guilt, was a yes to my own life, and this brought me peace and strength. Today, I can look back and acknowledge my evolution without shame or resentment. I became someone capable of putting myself first, without selfishness, simply preserving my balance and sanity. The freedom I gained was not only practical, but also emotional and spiritual. I learned that self-love and survival go hand in hand, and that it is possible to rebuild a life after years of manipulation and exploitation. Every difficult decision I made, every limit I imposed, was a form of rebirth. I know there will still be challenges, days when guilt and doubt may try to shake me, but now I know who I am and how far I can go without destroying myself. The history with my father and my family no longer needs to dictate my happiness. I chose myself, and that choice continues to strengthen me every day. I learned that true overcoming isn't about erasing pain, but living fully despite it, with courage, awareness, and self-love. My life is my own, and finally, I can breathe without fear of carrying other people's burdens.